a guilty plea under the Espionage Act in relation to obtaining and disclosing national defense information is obviously a very serious concern for journalists and national security journalists in general.
We'll have more on this story after headlines. We'll speak with Julian's brother and other advocates for his freedom. In Gaza, Israeli attacks have killed dozens of Palestinians over the past day, including 14 people who were sheltering in UN-run schools in northern Gaza. Another attack on Khan Yunis killed at least 10 Palestinians as they were either seeking or helping shield aid supplies. UNRWA head Philippe Lazzarini offered a stark assessment of the situation in Gaza 9 months into Israel's slaughter.
Gaza has been decimated. For more than 2 million Gazans, it is a living hell, a nightmare from which they cannot wake. Catastrophic levels of hunger across the Gaza Strip are the result of human action. Children are dying of malnutrition and dehydration, while food and clean water wait in trucks.
In Gaza City, Palestinians mourn the death of 2 medical workers killed by Israel, including Gaza's Director of Ambulance and Emergency Services, Hani al-Jafarwi. This is Hatem al-Swarki, who works at the Ministry of Health.
We appeal to the international institutions to take a clear stance on these continuous targeted attacks, as we have lost more than 400 health professionals in the Gaza Strip and more in detention. We lost dozens of health institutions to complete or partial destruction. We say to the world, isn't it time for you to stand up and to protect the Palestinian human, to protect medical crews and institutions, to respect the Palestinian ambulance badge?
An Israeli airstrike in the Shati refugee camp reportedly killed 10 relatives of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, including his sister. Meanwhile, in the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces have carried out more violent raids and arrested another 25 people. Israel's top court has ruled that ultra-Orthodox Jews in yeshiva schools are subject to the military draft and must immediately enlist or lose government funding. The Supreme Court decision risks further destabilizing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's fragile government coalition, which relies on 2 ultra-Orthodox parties. In Ukraine, Russian missile attacks killed at least 5 people, injured dozens of others in the eastern town of Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, Russia summoned the U.S. ambassador in Moscow and vowed to retaliate after a deadly Ukrainian strike on Crimea Sunday, which Russia says was carried out using U.S.-supplied missiles known as Ataxim. In Kenya, police deployed tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons on demonstrators as organizers call for a national strike and 7 days of rage to protest proposed tax hikes and demanding the resignation of Kenyan President William Ruto. Among the protesters was Alma Obama, the half-sister of Barack Obama, who was tear-gassed by police during a live interview on CNN.
How can you tear-gas your own people? Listen to them. Listen to these children. They're the future. They're 80% of our population. 80%. If they decided to turn against us, they can. And that is what they're doing now.
Reports have also emerged of a number of protesters who've gone missing. Authorities are surrounding the Kenyan parliament in Nairobi, which protesters plan to occupy. In other news from Kenya, armed forces are readying to deploy to Haiti with some 400 officers set to arrive there later this week. President William Ruto Monday held a ceremony for the first contingent of the UN-backed troops, part of a larger mission to combat worsening gang violence in Haiti. Many Haitians have opposed the mission, citing past international interventions that have contributed to political destabilization and humanitarian crises in Haiti. In New Caledonia, fresh protests have erupted after France extradited 7 independence activists, including protest leader Christian Kane, for pre-trial detention. New Caledonia has been under French control since its colonization by France in the 19th century, but some 40% of the population is Kanak, and a growing independence movement is seeking to end colonial rule. Back in the U.S., the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a challenge from the Biden administration to a Tennessee law blocking gender-affirming care for transgender youth. The case, which will be heard in the next term, could have major implications for trans rights in dozens of other Republican-led states. Rallies were held in front of the Supreme Court and across the country Monday as the nation marked 2 years since the right-wing-led court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending the constitutional right to an abortion. Nearly 24 states have since restricted abortion, with 14 states now banning the procedure. Vice President Kamala Harris spoke in Phoenix, Arizona, at a reproductive rights event marking the anniversary of the Dobbs ruling.
2 years ago today, the highest court in our land took a constitutional right that had been recognized from the people of America, from the women of America. And thereafter, in state after state, laws have been proposed and passed that criminalize healthcare providers. You know, in Texas, they provide prison for life.
In related news, a new study shows Texas has seen a 13% increase in infant and newborn deaths since the state imposed an abortion ban. And abortion is expected to be a major issue in Thursday night's debate between President Biden and former President Donald Trump. In Louisiana, a group of multi-faith and non-religious parents has filed a lawsuit over the state's new law mandating the Ten Commandments be displayed in public school classrooms. This is plaintiff Jeff Sims, a Presbyterian pastor with children in Louisiana public schools.
This new law doesn't just interfere with my and my children's religious freedom, it tramples on it. The separation of church and state means that families get to decide if, when, and how their children should be introduced to religious scripture and texts, not the state.
And prosecutors are recommending the Justice Department bring criminal charges against Boeing after the company violated a 2021 settlement that would have shielded Boeing from prosecution over 2 crashes in 2018 and 2019 that killed all 346 people on board. The Justice Department has until July 7th to decide whether to prosecute Boeing. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace. Now flying to the Pacific island of Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands, where he'll appear before a U.S. federal judge Wednesday morning. As part of the plea deal, Assange will plead guilty to a single felony count of illegally obtaining and disclosing national security material. He's expected to be sentenced to time served. Julian Assange will then be allowed to fly home to Australia. The shocking developments cap a more than decade-long legal ordeal for Julian Assange after he published classified documents detailing U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, including a video that showed a U.S. military Apache helicopter in Baghdad killing 12 civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists. WikiLeaks titled the video Collateral Murder. Press freedom groups have denounced successive U.S. administrations for targeting Assange, who'd been facing 175 years in U.S. prison if he'd been extradited and convicted. 12 years ago this month, Julian Assange entered the Ecuadorian embassy where he was given political asylum. He spent 7 years there. He has spent the last 5 years locked up in the harsh Belmarsh prison in London. His wife, Stella Assange, said earlier today, Julian will now seek a pardon after the plea deal.
Of course. I mean, I think that the correct course of action from the U.S. government should have been to drop the case entirely. We will be seeking a pardon, obviously. But the fact that there is a guilty plea under the Espionage Act in relation to obtaining and disclosing national defense information is obviously a very serious concern for journalists and national security journalists in general.
Earlier today, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said he wanted Julian Assange brought back home to Australia as soon as possible.
I've been very clear as both the Labor leader in opposition, but also as Prime Minister, that regardless of the views that people have about Mr. Assange's activities, the case has dragged on for too long. There's nothing to be gained by his continued incarceration, and we want him brought home to Australia. And we have engaged and advocated Australia's interests using all appropriate channels to support a positive outcome, and I've done that since very early on in my Prime Ministership. I will have more to say when these legal proceedings have concluded, which I hope will be very soon, and I will report as appropriate at that time.
I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, these are certainly stunning developments, and we're joined right now by three guests. In Washington, D.C., Trevor Timm is with us, Executive Director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, a group that's long advocated for Assange's release. In Sydney, Australia, Anthony Lowenstein is with us, independent journalist, longtime supporter of WikiLeaks, and author of the best-selling book, The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. And we're joined by Julian Assange's half-brother, the filmmaker Gabriel Shipton, joining us from La Rochelle, France. Gabriel, can you talk about these latest developments that have shocked many around the world? As we speak, Julian Assange has already landed in Bangkok, has left the maximum security prison Belmarsh, headed to Saipan, where he'll enter a U.S. district court, and then freed to go home to Australia. How did this all take place?
Well, this has been years, many years of advocacy at many levels across government, in Congress, through the media, through non-government organizations, advocacy organizations like Trevor Timm's Freedom of the Press Foundation. This has been a huge campaign that has been a global campaign, a grassroots campaign. And this is the culmination of that campaign. Right. The Australian government has, as you heard from the Prime Minister now, the Australian government has been really at the edge, the coalface now at the last moments, making sure that Julian can get home. They're the only government that can represent him diplomatically, but it's the real pressure from the Australian people that led them to be able to advocate so strongly for Julian Assange. So I've been speaking to Julian over the past week. He's been getting ready to get on this flight. It's all seems very surreal and overwhelming. I mean, we're overjoyed as Julian's family. He still has a couple of hurdles to get through, as you described, before he is completely safe and sound on Australian soil. But Stella and my dad are looking forward to meeting him on the tarmac once he arrives in Australia. And this is just such a happy moment for us.
There's a huge coalition of every major civil liberties organization, press freedom organization, and human rights organization in the country. And, you know, in the first few weeks of the Attorney General being in office, we, denounced the case and implored them to drop it. And that coalition repeated its call pretty much every 6 months for the last 3 years. President Biden has gone out of his way to talk about how journalism is not a crime, and that he respects press freedom. Yet this case has, essentially been hanging over journalists for the entire time they've been in office. They absolutely should have dropped it when they came into office. And you know what? They could have dropped it yesterday. And Julian Assange could have served the same amount of time in prison. They seem to have wanted a symbolic victory, which again, could potentially hang over the heads of national security journalists for years. So don't get me wrong, I don't blame Julian Assange for taking this deal at all. He's been through an incredibly harsh ordeal himself. But I do blame the the Biden administration. And, I hope this doesn't come back to haunt them and haunt us.
And could you talk some also about the conditions of Julian's confinement in Belmarsh?
You know, I think I just know from media reports that Julian has suffered from, a series of serious medical conditions and has been isolated for long periods of time when he's been there. You know, we have to remember that this case started during the Trump administration, and the Obama administration actually refused to prosecute Julian Assange for the exact reason that we're talking about now. Eric Holder in the Attorney General's office during the Obama administration was reported to talk about the fact that there was this quote unquote New York Times problem, that it would be impossible to prosecute Julian Assange without then affecting newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post, who of course also have reporters who talk to sources within the government, who ask them for documents, who receive documents, and then publish documents that the government considers classified. So the Obama administration actually rejected this case despite not liking Julian Assange at all. The Trump administration revived it. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has continued it on for 3 years. And, again, thankfully, Julian Assange is finally going free today. But the press freedom implications, I think, remain to be seen.
I wanted to bring Anthony Lowenstein into this conversation, independent journalist based in Sydney. It's where Julian Assange is expected to fly into to meet with his family on the tarmac. His wife Stella talked about she has not known him since she met him when he was under house arrest. You know, Democracy Now! Also has interviewed him over the years, from when he wore an ankle bracelet to when he got political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. If you can talk about being an Australian and from Australia, your Prime Minister and the Parliament of Australia coming behind Julian Assange and then weighing in with President Biden each time he met with him, Anthony, and what Julian Assange means in Australia.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Amy and Juan. Look, the release of Julian is a big story here for obvious reasons. I think a lot of Australians for years have felt incredibly angry with the fact that an Australian citizen, Julian Assange, is being prosecuted in the US under the Espionage Act. He's not an American citizen. He's barely spent any time in America. And I think it goes to the heart of how many Australians feel about the relationship between the US and Australia. Often Australians feel like we're, and I agree with this, a client state of the US. This is because of joining every single war in the Middle East, wars in Vietnam. We have a massive US intelligence base, Pine Gap, in the centre of Australia. Australia really is not an independent nation. And the idea of the US prosecuting Julian for journalism, which was, as Trevor rightly says, what so many decent journalists do every day, speaking to sources inside government and elsewhere, was an outrage. And I think for many years, a lot of Australians, the majority, in fact, of Australians wanted him to come home. I'm obviously glad that the current government has done that, mostly behind the scenes. I mean, for many, many years, the former government, much more conservative one, had no interest in trying to get Julian Assange home. And I think it just goes to the heart also, because I've been knowing WikiLeaks since 2006 when they first launched, started to get to know Julian then from the beginning when he launched it in Melbourne, Australia. And really from the beginning, his whole idea was that so much of mainstream journalism was too close to those in power. And as anyone who is a journalist or a citizen or anyone interested in accountability, there's really no media organisation in my adult life that has released more vital documents about the state of global power than WikiLeaks, from Guantanamo to Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, the drug war. So many documents which you can access free on their website. And I think that goes to the heart why many Australians, in fact, felt very proud, because in some ways in the last decades, there are two major global figures of media interest from Australia. Rupert Murdoch, who's obviously very, very right-wing, and Julian Assange, who obviously is a very, very different person. So there's elation in Australia today, and rightly so.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that, Anthony, the impact of Julian and WikiLeaks on the practice of modern journalism. It seems to me that it has not been the same since WikiLeaks first came on the scene. And if you could to speculate about the impact that he has had on the practice of reporting?
Well, it's been profound, and obviously WikiLeaks started really before social media took off. I mean, 2006 there was Facebook, but it was in its infancy. And really now every major media organization has a so-called Dropbox where sources can deliver information. I think there is a much greater awareness in at least some aspects of the mainstream press that there needs to be more accountability and transparency around their actions. I think that's not as much as there should be, to be clear. And I think also what it's done, it really ties into a larger picture of how many people in the world, really, in the global south or the north, increasingly do not trust those in the mainstream press for not reporting the reality of what's going on, whether it's the war in Palestine, whether it's the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 20 years, the war on terror, Guantanamo, torture. And I think a lot of people in the public demand much more accountability from the mainstream press, but they're not getting it. And if you look at pretty much any public opinion poll of the mainstream press by the public, there is deep contempt for a lot of us in our profession. Not all, of course, not all, but many in the mainstream press are not treated with respect. And I think WikiLeaks, in some ways, the documents that they have released over years now, close to 20 years, I think often has shown up the mainstream press. I think is why so many journalists still to this day, there have obviously been many reporters who have supported Julian over the years, to be sure, but I think a lot of journalists are being jealous. I think there's a lot of professional jealousy around what WikiLeaks has achieved in its life. And obviously what happens now is up to Julian and WikiLeaks as an organization. Who knows where it'll go? But I think the legacy is very clear, and the documents that they have released, even if they release nothing else beyond this date, their legacy is set because of the vital documents that they've put into the public domain.
I want to, Anthony, go to the collateral murder video shot in July 2007, leaked by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. The now infamous video showed U.S. forces killing 12 people, including 2 Reuters employees, Saeed Shama and Namir Nur Eldin, an up-and-coming videographer in Iraq. They were killed when they were opened fire on by an Apache helicopter.
Let me know when you get it. What you? Light them all up. 2 traffic, 260s. Come on, fire. We need to move time now. All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
Reuters driver, 40-year-old Saeed Shama, father of 4, survived the initial attack. He's seen trying to crawl away as a helicopter flies overhead. And this is footage, by the way, taken by the Apache helicopter. U.S. forces open fire again when they notice a van pulling up to evacuate the wounded Saeed Shama.
Bodies. Where's that van at? Right down there by the body. Okay, yeah. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene, looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons.
Hey, we need to stop that. We need to get down there. We need to stop that. You see my look?
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1-8, request permission to engage. Picking up the wounded. Now we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let's shoot. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8. You're taking him. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8.
It's Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or bongo truck picking up the box. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
1-8, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear. Clear. Orange. Coming around, clear. Roger. Trying to, clear. I lost him in the... I got him. Should have a van in the middle of the road with about 12 to 15
that last ha. In the van, it was a father who was driving his two children to school, and he had stopped to help the Reuters employee. Reuters had applied for years to try to get a hold of the video that showed the killing of their two workers, the videographer, Namir Noreldin and Saeed Shama. They couldn't get it. It was only when WikiLeaks released it that the world saw. It's called, by WikiLeaks, the Collateral Murder video, again shot in July 2007, leaked by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. And I want to go from this video, Anthony, and the significance of this, that video shot in 2007, coming as a new report by